preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education for the Humanities, and I'd like to welcome you to this final evening of The Shape of the City. I'd like to take a moment for a brief announcement. The 92nd Street Y is pleased to have received a $500,000 challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to develop and support programs such as this evening's. We are now within close reach of meeting the match. Your contribution will help us to meet it soon. The envelope which you received upon entering the hall can be used to send us your tax-deductible contribution, and your generosity will be deeply appreciated. I would like also to take a moment to thank Paul Goldberger for serving as moderator for the 4th year of this very special series. Paul's involvement in both the conception and execution of this series is deeply appreciated by me, my colleagues at the Y, our guest speakers, and I believe you can support me in this by you, our audience. The breadth and depth of Paul's knowledge and his eloquence, charm, and more than occasional wit has given this series its special vitality and enduring high quality over the years. Please join me in thanking Paul Goldberger. And now to the evening before us. Although there will not be a slide presentation this evening, the rest of the format remains the same. Following the conversation on stage, you will have the opportunity to submit written questions on the index cards you received as you entered the hall. Our guests tonight are Dean Macris and Con Howe. Director of Planning of the City of San Francisco, a position to which he was appointed in 1981, Dean Macris has, during his tenure, initiated several important projects which have received national recognition, including a plan for downtown San Francisco, plans and programs for Chinatown, and a unique program whereby major office space developers provide housing funds. Mr. Macris was born and raised in Illinois, attended college in Missouri, and completed his graduate studies in city planning at the University of Illinois. Following graduate school, he joined the staff of the Department of Development and Planning in Chicago. In 1966, Mayor Daley appointed him Assistant Commissioner of the department. From Chicago, Mr. Macris moved to San Francisco, serving as Assistant Director of the Department of City Planning, the Director of Community Development, and Associate Executive Director of the Association of Bay Area Government before assuming his current position. Con Howe, our local representative this evening, is currently Director of the Manhattan office of the New York City Department of City Planning, a position he has held since 1982. Educated at Yale, Mr. Howe received his master's degree from the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. He first worked in city planning during the Lindsay administration when he was an urban fellow. Mr. Howe served as Assistant Secretary to the Governor of Massachusetts and as Executive Director of the Massachusetts Land Bank, a state redevelopment agency involved in projects along the Boston waterfront. In 1978, he was appointed Assistant Director in the New York Department of City Planning, this being the appointment prior to his current position as Director. It is a privilege to welcome our guests this evening, Dean Macris and Con Howe, and our moderator, Paul Goldberger. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those nice words and applause. It is hard to believe that I will actually have a Monday night again after this week. These 5, I don't know how many of you have been at all 5 sessions, but they've gone remarkably quickly and been fascinating for me. And I want to extend my appreciation to all of you who've hung on through all 5, or even some of them, and hope that as many of you as can will be with us if we do another round sometime next year. I want to begin by expressing my thanks both to Dean Macris in the middle and Con Howe on your left for making a long journey to this stage. Dean coming across the country from San Francisco, Con coming all the way up on the IRT from downtown, which can feel much longer under certain circumstances, and is certainly more ambitious a trip. Our theme will be related to, but not identical to, the things we've discussed over the last few weeks. It will be city planning, and most specifically the question of density, high-rise construction, center city commercial cores. San Francisco has been more daring than any city in America in attempting to guide and control large-scale growth. Some might say it had to be because it had also been more decimated by such growth over the years, but that's something we can discuss in the next few minutes. New York has not proposed anything as radical as San Francisco's new zoning, but under Con Howe's guidance and that of his colleague Herb Sturz, there have been substantial rethinkings and changes in the midtown zoning laws, and the issue is, as I need tell nobody, as urgent in New York as it is in San Francisco. In fact, it seemed, if anything, all the more pressing today as I attended a news conference this morning at which a certain developer by the name of Trump announced that we really do not have enough tall buildings in New York, and he will solve that by putting a 150-story building on the site of Lincoln West on the Penn Central rail yards on the west side. We can get back to that in a few minutes. Let me begin by asking Dean Macris if he can give us a sort of quick summary of the new San Francisco plan, which was made public, as I recall, the end of 1983, and then became law in 1985. Is that right?
That's correct,
Good.
Paul. And it is a city ordinance at this point. And asking a city planner to summarize this plan in 3 minutes will be extraordinarily difficult. But let me...
You can take 10 minutes if you can make it feel like 3 minutes.
No, I'll do the best I can. I think I would like to say to the audience first that planners in San Francisco have a really remarkable setting, unprecedented perhaps anywhere else in the country, to plan in the first place. There is a public demand that good planning be accomplished, and certainly the political atmosphere for it, as you well know, exists. So with that background and with the strong concern about the extraordinary amount of building going on in San Francisco by 1979, 1980, it was a compelling move for us to prepare something that reflected city attitude it really in two ways. One, the desire to continue with a certain level of job growth. After all, the downtown of San Francisco is our economic engine. At the same time, not be overwhelmed by this growth. In many ways, they are competing objectives. So that we established what we believe to be a very balanced system of controls that greatly reduces what can be built in downtown San Francisco. We have had for some years height limits in downtown, as a matter of fact we do in the whole city. The city is only 45 square miles to well over 300 square miles of New York, so the scale difference has to be appreciated here. But we greatly reduced the heights of that buildings can be built at to downtown, greatly reduced the floor area ratios, which perhaps most of the audience knows what that means. In the core of the area, we reduced them by 30 or 40%. And we created a system of transferable development rights to give incentive. Incentive is a weak term here, really to force development to go south of the downtown area to a more appropriate location where we felt growth could be absorbed.
In effect, to expand the downtown.
To expand the downtown, but to move it south. Mm-hmm. Now, along with that was developed a whole set of intricate rules about wind and shadow and sunlight, so standards were set. For example, no building today by law can exceed 11 miles per hour at ground level in wind. If it does, it'll have to be redesigned to accommodate that. We've established architectural controls in really an indirect way because we believe that at certain levels, buildings should be tapered as they go up and for views to the sky and sunlight. We also made a rather strong case for having more distinctive architecture, more sculptured tops, more distinctive tops in the city, because after 20 years of building on the international style, the skyline of the city had become rather brutal in a very even line of flat top buildings. So we felt there had to be a departure from that, and I think we were only attaching ourselves to a trend, at any rate, towards what was happening in architecture in America. Beyond that, and yes.
I can interrupt and say, aren't you
Go ahead.
attaching yourself to a trend now too?
Well, maybe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's a problem. I think it's a better trend, but on the other hand, that's just my view.
Yes.
One certainly can't say it's not a trend.
Well, I think
the other
it
direction.
makes sense for San Francisco, and I want to hasten to add, we don't believe that all these new approaches developed for San Francisco are transferable to other cities. To try to limit myself in time here, I wanted to touch on two other aspects because there are open space requirements, there are many other kinds of requirements we could talk about. But through the political process of the plan, there were certain other features developed that I wanted to say at the outset. One was that the idea that there's a civic purpose to building, and that San Francisco had been very involved in that even the few years before adoption of this new ordinance. We felt that not only is there a civic purpose in architecture and urban design and how the building relates to its neighbors, there was also a partnership that was needed in sharing and to resolve city problems. So we had experimented with the idea of developers contributing to, for example, housing. And we
You were the first in the country
to do that. And up to this point, we have now, under that program, in the last 3 or 4 years in San Francisco, actually 3 years, collected $26 million through this process of developers contributing to a housing fund, and it produced some 3,000 housing units, or caused to have them produced. We added on to that program. It now costs the developer within the central area of the city that adds to office space in that area to contribute $5 per square foot to improve public transit. The new code also adds beyond that. It is now $2 per square foot of office space for open space, and it's $1 per square foot for child care. And the fifth similar fee is a 1% of the total construction cost of the project must go to public art, accessible public art. So that is one set of things that I think the New York audience ought to know, that we now have probably the most extensive package of obligations in office development in the country. Now, other cities, Boston, New York, Chicago, is thinking about a housing fee, linkages, it's called out east. We don't use that term. We're much more direct in California. The other thing I wanted to cite was the political process, and the mayor and the planning department resolved the notion of the rate of development. It was the one issue that the downtown plan had not considered, was the rate of development, the pace at which office space comes on the market. The conclusion to that saga became an annual limit of a total for over 3 years of no more than 2.85 million square feet of office space can be approved by the San Francisco City Planning Commission. It means for us, and I will stop with this, it means that the planning department now is busily engaged in developing a set of regulations and procedures for allocating that space. The Board of Supervisors, our legislative body, has given that responsibility totally to the Planning Department and the Planning Commission. So we are now devising a set of procedures by which we will allocate that space. It may be fascinating to discuss that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. As the San Francisco plan has evolved, it seems to me it's, if anything, gone from being initially the most radical downtown zoning plan any city has had in this country to becoming even more radical and even more extreme.
Yes.
Which I suppose, if anything, that more than any other factor explains the particular nature of San Francisco, that a plan that most other cities could not conceive of because it was too extreme, as it went through the political process in San Francisco to win approval, became only more extreme.
Right, exactly.
But,
I would say we're probably the first city in the world to consciously reduce the potential for job development.
Right.
As a matter of public policy, probably the first city in the world to take that step.
We will discuss the pros and cons of that in a minute. Let me just ask you a quick question. What's the total of all of the sort of related fees and other things? I mean, if you are building a 500,000 square foot building,
well,
what do you got to pay per square foot?
If you were building a $1 million or $1 million square foot
Okay.
building, let's say, which is, my math is going to require.
It's easier
this.
that
I suppose
way,
I
right.
could cut it in
Okay.
half, but it is about $13 or $14 per square foot added on to the cost.
That's a lot.
Of that package. Yeah, so we're talking about $14 million of add-on.
Yeah. Con, would developers in New York ever stand for such a thing?
Well, they stand for a lot of changes in zoning. The city always wants to be first in many things, and forgive me for pointing out that New York City had the first zoning code in 1916, and I think that the changes that you're referring to in San Francisco have some precedent in New York. It was 3.5 years ago that the City Planning Commission and the Board of Estimate made, as you said, Paul, not exactly radical changes, but I think certainly the most significant ones since the zoning had been in place for Midtown. And what I think would be interesting in comparing the New York experience and getting to see the San Francisco experience is looking at the differences, because there are differences between the cities, and as you said, solutions that are right in San Francisco may not be right in Manhattan, and vice versa. And actually, I think right now is a very important time to be assessing the experience in New York, because the first buildings that have been constructed under this new zoning are just now being completed. And we can get into it in more detail, but we think that we're looking right now at what those changes have brought about. The whole emphasis of the zoning changes to stabilize development on the overcrowded east side and to move development to the west side of Midtown. We feel that that's begun to be successful. Some of the statistics, just to throw out a few, is that before the Midtown zoning, only about 20% of development in Midtown was on the west side. Now, in the 3 years since the zoning was passed, it's about half. And so it does show.
Sure it does, although if I can play the devil's advocate, a role that I may find myself in a lot, couldn't one say that that's really because everything got filled up on the east side? It just there was no more room?
I think that there's a lot of factors, but actually the buildings that are being built on the east side are sites that were assembled and were known as development sites. The other thing that I'm sure Dean would agree with is that zoning is just one small piece in any of the record of development, that frankly the market forces, whether it be San Francisco or New York or wherever, is going to be a more strong determinant. And some of these changes could have been done in the depths of a recession, and there would be no movement one way or the other. If they happen to occur at a time when the market is strong and there's a lot of development, then I think the goal of guiding development really begins to be achieved.
We're dealing with a situation, I guess, in which you could say that market forces push you in one direction, and what we might call cultural forces push you in the other. Is that accurate, would you say?
Well, I was listening to Con's point, but by the way, there is another feature of the plan
Sure.
I should mention, and it's integral to our discussion. The plan by law prevents the demolition of 250 buildings in downtown San Francisco. Well, one of the, I think, strong features of our plan, it was not a generalized plan. The decision we made early on was to go lot by lot, building by building, because people were very concerned about losing 7 or 8 significant buildings, either architecturally significant or historically significant buildings in this downtown area in San Francisco, so that we went lot by lot. We rated every existing building, and by sweeping legislation, the board has landmarked preventing the demolition. It is not wait 6 months and then demolish.
Right.
You cannot
Just
tear
period.
down the building.
Right.
You can do that, but there is an elaborate list of submissions that you have to make to prove that the building is uneconomical and has no use value. Now, that is an extraordinarily difficult thing to achieve. We expect no demolition to occur.
In other words, it must have what you deem to be both economic value and use value.
That's right.
Right.
If it has no value for either reason, you can demolish. But the establishing that case would be extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we were advised to do that by our attorneys, of course, because you just can't flat out say no demolition. At any rate, there is that very strong feature of the plan. The thing that concerned us about the market, and even today, Paul, with the annual limitation that we have of around 950,000 square feet for each of those 3 years, developers continue to offer new places to build downtown. It is almost as if they're viewing business as usual under this new system, and that cannot be. We have under review in the city planning department now some 7 or 8 million square feet, but we can only approve a 950,000 square
So
feet.
even if it all conforms to the plan, you still can't
Right.
approve it. Right.
The point that we are continually alerted to is that the market seems to be fueled not so much by supply and demand, and there have been some recent articles about this now in journals and even in newspapers, that the pension funds and insurance companies and foreign investment seems to take a very long-term view
Right.
towards this office building, and is not willing to put money in non-office sectors. Housing, for example. Hotels could be argued are overbuilt in this country. There are very few places that you can put real estate money, and so that even though we have about 7 million square feet of office space under construction in this 1 square mile representing downtown San Francisco, there is a desire to build more, even though vacancy rates are rising. It gives pause to what's happening to the market, and is it cyclical anymore as it always have been. San Francisco has never had a vacancy rate much over 5 or 6% historically. Yet today we are probably somewhere at 12, 13% and rising.
You're at 12, 13%, you're rising, and yet still building.
Still building.
That's-
And that's what
yeah.
concerns us, and that gave a very strong argument to let's control the rate of growth, because nobody was interested politically or culturally in having vacant office buildings standing around waiting to be absorbed.
But what you're saying is that because of the extraordinary desire of investors to invest in office buildings, the normal supply and demand system just doesn't seem to work.
Doesn't seem to be working at
I
the
mean, the
moment.
supply is full, and the demand isn't there, and yet the supply still keeps getting increased.
Right.
Do you think some of that was plans that were already in process? I mean, I think a lot of, when a site has been assembled and there's been commitments of financing to it, even if they expect the market not to continue to rise, there's a sort of movement ahead anyway. And I wonder what effect it'll have on the planning and assemblage of sites going on now.
Let me comment in two ways about that. I don't know which way to look.
Look both ways. It's all right.
By the way, as near as I can tell, this does not look like a California audience to me. But I can't see beyond the third row.
We'll see what kind of questions they come up with. That'll be the test.
That's what scares me. Two or three things I'd like to say about that. One is that part of the argument was that the reason there was a heated market in San Francisco was the clamor to build before all these new rules came into place. So there was the argument that we were driving the market as a planning department because we were engaged in this new plan that was going to cause a lot of consternation in the development field. I would accept that idea if I understood now we still are having new buildings being proposed of substantial size for San Francisco, even though the new rules are in place and we have the annual limit. So I am a skeptic at this point as to precisely what's happening in investment in office building in the country.
That's a very good point. Let me ask you about this annual limit, since that in some ways is the most extraordinary thing in the whole plan, and it's the only one, if I'm correct, that has no real equivalent in anybody else's laws anywhere. Who decides what gets built?
Well,
I mean, if you can build 900,000 square feet within a given year, shall we say, and developers come to you with a total of $5 million worth of projects, who is it? Is it the guy with the prettiest building? Is it the person who gave the most to the mayor's campaign fund? I mean, what criteria does one use?
Yes. There needs to be a certain background to that. First of all, the quick answer is that the San Francisco Planning Department and Commission makes the decision under
which means you and your staff.
That's essentially correct, but we do have 7 people on the Planning Commission who vote.
Right.
But let me explain that, first off, that the Planning Commission in San Francisco has extraordinary power and has had it for many years. I want to quickly sketch this because it isn't as if all of a sudden there's an abrupt change to what's been going on in the last several years. The Planning Commission has the sole responsibility on the city charter to prepare the city's master plan. It is particularly important in California because state law is very strong about what are the components of a master plan. And if you don't have them, you are subject to litigation because we're a very litigious city and with a lot of people looking over our shoulder about the planning process. The state law further says that the zoning ordinance must be in conformance with the city's master plan. So you have the San Francisco Planning Commission right off having sole responsibility for the master plan. It is not reviewed by the legislative body, and then it must construct the zoning code to be in conformance with that plan. Secondly, almost any major development in San Francisco, people say now that any major building of any kind, and that could be quite small under certain circumstances, requires a conditional use permit from the San Francisco Planning Commission. We are a very regulated city, and I could sketch that out in some detail because it's fascinating. But once the commission makes a decision either for the project under a conditional use permit or against it, the appeal is to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, again, the legislative body. It takes 8 out of 11 votes at the board to overturn the Planning Commission. Virtually impossible to do. So every builder knows that once the decision is made by the commission, the likelihood of changing that decision is nearly zero. The third thing I would cite is that the commission also has the peculiar power of discretionary review. It means even though the building proposed conforms to all the rules and regulations and all the codes of the city, the commission can call it before it and modify the proposal or reject the proposal, and it does that as a matter of routine. So here you have a commission that can adjust the rules. Many people argue that our zoning code is merely a guideline.
It would sound, given discretionary review, it would sound that way.
Yes.
And it's what we call as of right here.
It does not exist in San Francisco.
Yeah, there is no right to as of right, in effect.
That's right.
Right.
So that the commission has had this authority for many years.
Right.
So to suggest now that all of a sudden it has some brand new authority, which it does, but against that background, it is not so stark an exaggeration to suggest that this commission will now decide who gets allocated that square footage for office space. There are criteria set out in the ordinance, Paul. They're very broad. We are articulating those criteria now into a more refined set of regulations for allocation. But one of the things that is cited in the ordinance is architectural quality. Extraordinarily subjective. If anybody in the country knows that, it's you. The planning department is going to be involved in making some judgment about architectural quality.
I mean, that's a tough one, as you've alluded. I mean, nothing is better in principle than the idea that a city would make judgment about who is permitted to build and who is not on the basis of architectural quality, and yet one man's architectural quality could be another man's horror show. And it seems to me as though that's a kind of Pandora's box to open that as a criteria. Con,
it's also interesting that, as you say, so much of this discretionary power, because in New York City, the thrust has actually been the opposite. One of the changes in our midtown zoning 3 years ago was to move away from what was called negotiated zoning, where developers...
I thought you were going to say to move away from architectural quality.
We'll let everyone decide that. But to move away from project-by-project review, where I think, frankly, the public was skeptical that the public was getting its fair share, that in terms of bonus floor area being awarded for amenities that were not things that people felt were that useful. And so one of the changes in the midtown zoning was to establish standards that parallel many of the things you're doing, but frankly not with the same kind of specificity, and to allow developers to build under those standards with no further discretionary review from the Planning Commission. And of the 26 buildings that have been approved, and by approved I mean really by the Buildings Department, who
have really been processed almost more than approved, right?
85% of them have been as of right. So there's really only been a few that have had discretionary approval by the Planning Commission, and it's one of those things that can be debated either way. But I think that we're trying to spend more of our time in looking at the standards, the underlying standards, which all buildings should meet, and allow the developer and specifically the architect to have really great flexibility in how to architecturally achieve those standards. I think that if you look at the 26 buildings, you'll find some that are wretched, and you'll find some that are really first-class architecture. So I think it really gets back to the problem of, can government legislate good architecture? I think that in New York, it seems to me the approach has always been towards flexibility, towards diversity of architecture, and it has the advantage of some great architecture, and it has some disadvantages, some very dismal.
I'd use that to sort of take a step back, if we can, to the culture of the two cities, and try to look a little less at some of the specifics of zoning and at the broader question. It seems to me as though one of the things we're dealing with is a general perception that the skyscraper is part and parcel of the cultural as well as the economic tradition of New York. It's something people expect to see, something they believe in, whereas in San Francisco, it's always been a little more of an intruder. And therefore, there's been a broadly based cultural expectation that the city government has a right to be harder and harsher and more limiting there than in New York. Does that sound right?
It does to me. think that the whole thrust of city planning, urban design, architecture has to take a different perspective in San Francisco. I mean, after all, we are a very compact city. What you're struck by in San Francisco is not the diversity of architecture. What you're struck by is the unity of architecture. Right. If you're looking at San Francisco from Marin County and looking south across the bay after you've crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, what you're absolutely struck by is the scale of the buildings, the color and hue of the city, and the very Mediterranean aspect of our city.
So long as your eye doesn't hit the Bank of America
correct.
building.
I was going to cite the Bank of America. The Bank of America building, built in the middle 60s, very dark granite, its bulk and scale. The mass of that building is far beyond anything that we'd ever had in the city before or after. It sticks out there like, well, we won't use any obscene. It would have been a great building in Chicago. It's an outstanding building for Chicago. It is the wrong building for San Francisco. So that our approach is not necessarily to encourage diversity and glamour in architecture. Mm-hmm. The planning department's responsibility in design is for livability and compatibility. And we are often at odds with architects who, as you know, want to make statements for themselves and their clients. We are not interested in that. We are interested in how that building fits into the environment of San Francisco. We are a very conservative city architecturally. When a building turns out wrong in San Francisco, the architect is not blamed, the planning department is blamed. We assume that responsibility, but with that responsibility, I think comes for us to take a very determined, harsh look as to what is the civic nature of this building, and is it adding to San Francisco's unity? Right. That is not necessarily the goal in New York.
I think it's interesting that you say that you're blamed, because obviously with that greater responsibility that follows.
I think we're blamed too.
You may be, but you're not as blamed alone. I mean, in fact, I think the average New Yorker who walks up Third Avenue doesn't grumble at goddamn city planning department. I mean, he will be more likely to complain about developers and architects, both of whom in New York are perceived to have more power. I think that is correct. How do developers deal with the San Francisco situation? I mean, we are at least given to believe, possibly we're brainwashed by New York developers, that they would never stand for regulations this tough, that if the City Planning Commission even hinted at things that went a tenth of the way towards San Francisco, every developer in New York would start building in New Jersey immediately, and the city would be finished. I have always suspected that there's a little bit of exaggeration to that. Nonetheless, it's clear that the demands being put on a commercial real estate developer by the city of San Francisco are greater than those put on him or her by any other city. What do they say? I mean, do they say, listen, I'm just going to go to Oakland and the hell with you? Or obviously they don't, or you wouldn't still have buildings to review.
That's a very good question, because it brings to mind the rather hazardous first few months of my time as planning director. There had been some experimenting with the idea when I arrived, and the market in San Francisco by 1980-81 was extraordinary. The vacancy rate was nearly zero. In San Francisco, if not zero. People were waiting for people to move out of buildings to get in them. And the idea of first of all, you have to understand the San Francisco Planning Commission did not have an ordinance, did not have any city law. It finally said, after the planning director, with the support of the mayor, said that we will impose this rule. We did it simply with the power of the commission. To say that each developer would have to contribute the equivalent of a little over $5 per square foot for housing. Now, there was no city ordinance that did that. And what we said was that we're going to do this under the authority of the Planning Commission's discretionary review power. Nobody took us to court, to our amazement. So for
in New York,
right.
that would never
So
happen.
for 3 years,
Right.
prior to the adoption of the plan that we're speaking about tonight, the commission simply imposed that rule, collected the $26 million, set up a fund, and the city council or the board of supervisors had nothing to do with it. An extraordinary situation. Now, in the early part of that, the downtown business organizations were absolutely appalled at this circumstance. The mayor, Mayor Feinstein, was convinced, after a great deal of skepticism early on, that it made sense. And with her support, we went around endlessly to these business organizations, the developer groups, architectural groups, to make our case. We took quite a beating, but we stuck to it. It became institutionalized. Nobody sued us. We did get sued over the transit fee because it wasn't handled, I think, as well as it should have been by the government. But there is an acceptance now of this idea. It was not done quietly. There was an extraordinary amount of disgruntlement and a lot of threats that we're going to move our development.
So they did
elsewhere
threaten that.
Absolutely they did. Now, we didn't have anything to prove that except our instincts.
Right.
That the desire to build in the city of San Francisco was so strong, they would overcome their hostility towards this system of charging so they could participate in resolving problems. Only instinct was suggesting us that were possible. No one really believed they were going to go to Oakland. No one really believed that, truthfully.
Con?
See, I think a lot of this does have to do with supply, and maybe, again, it's a different situation because New York's supply of office spaces is a 250 million square feet of office space, and so it's a much larger base. But no one feels sorry for the law firm that their rent goes from $50 a square foot to $60 a square foot, because everyone assumes they just pass it on to their clients. But I think in a city economy, there's so many firms that simply couldn't exist in space like that, and they have to find space at the $20 a square foot or $25, which are frankly high rates by other cities.
But in New York,
anyway.
those are low, right?
And I think one of the really important trends in the last few years in New York has been the renovation of office buildings along Park Avenue South and Lower Fifth Avenue, and actually that whole area, we could call it Midtown South, but it's allowed firms who can't afford the brand new office buildings. It's allowed them basically a supply of office space. And I think that in the same way that people don't care so much about the fancy law firms, they do care about the millions and millions of people who work in firms that are smaller and in industries that are just not going to be able to sustain that kind of rent. I don't know if in San Francisco the experience is that older office buildings, have their rents climbed as high, or?
I have discovered recently that office rents are extraordinarily elastic. The argument was, Mr. Macris and the planning department, you're driving the rents up with this system, and at the peak time in San Francisco, you could perhaps get $47 a square foot, $48 a square foot if you were in a Philip Johnson building. But today, that same space has dropped in some cases to 30%. These are the very buildings we were imposing the fees on. So that how these buildings are financed to city planners get very mysterious. And where is the give here? Our rents are dropping in San Francisco because space is available. Bonuses are being offered, 6 months delays in rents and so forth by the very buildings that were carrying these fees that we're speaking about.
Sure. On the housing again, you said that so far $26 million has been collected through this housing fee. What has that $26 million bought so far?
Well, we've, as I mentioned, the idea of about 3,000 units have been caused to be made available. And I use the term cause because we have used the money in a variety of ways, and we continue to collect the money and use it in a variety of ways. I remember some of the first monies went to taking vacant public housing units, restoring them and putting them back on the market. We've converted high-rise public housing.
Rosa Parks is an example of that, right?
From a family, which it wasn't working as a high-rise, and converted it to elderly housing. We have filled the gap financially with some old Section 8 housing projects, so that they were failing to make ends meet. We've used money to fill the gap. We have used it in private ways as well to fill shortages in funds to make housing available. And we have used it with our mortgage revenue bond program for first-time home buyers by further supplementing those mortgage revenue bonds, because costs of housing is so high in San Francisco. We lead the nation in those costs. So we have used it to write down mortgages for first-time buyers as well. Now, aside from that program, all of it has gone to low and moderate income housing. It is targeted for low, moderate income.
What about the child care provision at $1 a foot? That's $1 million in a 1 million square foot building. Has that yet gone into effect or been used?
Well, we didn't please George Will. He actually wrote a column about our child care provision, figuring it was the last, the kind of thing you'd expect from California, particularly San Francisco. The program works that either you provide a minimum of 3,000 square feet in the building itself, which we think is going to be difficult to do because certain state laws require that space to be at the ground level, or perhaps...
Which means they'd be forfeiting the most valuable retail space.
Exactly. Or in certain cases, the second level, and you have to have some open space along with it, or you contribute $1 square foot to a citywide fund. And once again, the planning department, the planning director, is responsible for the allocation of that money. And we have set up a task force to work with us, of child care people, to work with us in the allocation of that money. Now, we've already got about $1 million in that fund, and that's only been about a month old.
You're about to begin
Yes.
to decide what to do with that.
Yes.
Okay. Let me call for all of your questions, which in a moment we'll turn to. I think the ushers are moving around now. Con, is that at all practical in New York?
Well, see, one thing that interests me is I think every one of those programs or goals is something that ought to be done. But what I don't really understand is why it isn't just done the old-fashioned way through taxation. I mean, I think that I find it hard to understand why all of these charges are placed strictly on new development, when in many cases someone who's bought an office building 5 years ago for $20 million, it's now worth $40 million. And somehow, certainly the impacts of that office building, its effects on housing or transit are equal or could be greater than a building next door. The effect is not the newness of the building. The effect comes from its size and how many people work there, how many people travel there. I know that, believe me, I know that there's a trend in this. I just got back from Boston a few weeks ago, and their downtown plan is looking for exactly the same linkages. And I don't think there's any disputing the goals. Certainly all the housing programs and the transit are all things that ought to be supported by public funds. But I just think it's how those funds are brought in. And I think it would be a more across the board, and frankly, it would generate more revenue if there was, whether it be a charge on capital gains or charges on mortgage transfer taxes, or something that would frankly look at all development equally, rather than just whether you happen to be the guy that isn't in the ground yet.
I suppose it could even be a commercial occupancy tax too, couldn't it? As simple as that.
Well, I think those are all very good points, and the Mayor Flynn of Boston did come to visit us recently. He raised some of the very questions, Con, that you're talking about. I agree that it should be broadened. And as a matter of fact, we're looking at the possibility of broadening some of those programs to existing buildings. But we took a very incremental approach to this. Politically, I think we took the correct approach. It's easy to say in hindsight because we've been somewhat successful at it. But you have to remember, in California, we are severely limited through the property tax by Prop 13. And you have to remember also that the existing buildings, the commercial buildings as well as residential and homes as well, are getting enormous tax breaks right now. And we're very conscious of that because Prop 13 freezes property tax at the 1975 level. So here you have these downtown buildings of some size for us, paying a property tax
It's just
nowhere
capped.
near what, right, because it's capped. So that we're taking now a look at existing buildings and trying to broaden that. And we're doing that in an incremental way. Again, a part of the downtown plan, you have to provide with a new building a transportation broker for the life of the building. And the transportation broker is on the site, working with users of the building on ride sharing, on flex time, on van pooling, attempting to get some adjustment to our somewhat overcrowded public transit system. We are looking now to broaden that requirement to existing buildings and not just to new buildings.
See, the one thing about the zoning provisions that end up bringing in revenue, I understand in San Francisco's case where each one has been geared towards impacts that are perceived by the building. But what I fear, if zoning becomes seen as a revenue-generating tool, the day will come when people will not make a decision on what's proper in terms of scale and character, but will make it on the basis of, well, let's get some money. You know, this has been lean times this decade in the city. We need housing here, we need parks there. Let's let these people do whatever they want in a certain part of town, and we'll make a lot of money off of it. And I think that's, believe me, I don't think that's happening in
Sure.
San Francisco,
Okay.
but I think that the juxtaposition of revenue production with zoning, which really originated as a tool to control land use, is just something that has to be very cautiously guarded.
It seems to me, though, that one of the rationales, is it not, is the idea, sort of taking as a given the idea that large-scale new construction is really not an unfettered good thing. Therefore, if someone is going to receive the privilege of building a big downtown building, he should pay the city something beyond normal taxes. Is that not sort of an unspoken rationale behind it, philosophically?
That is the rationale. And I would also point out that this really is not a new idea. For decades since World War II, and certainly more recently than that, subdividers, people who have been building subdivision housing in California, have been providing in suburban areas space for a new park, space for schools, participating in the cost of new sewers and roads. They've been doing it in the suburbs,
Sure.
I would argue, for years. It just simply hasn't been a concept transferred to built-up cities. Cities such as New York and San Francisco, who I believe still have the same kinds of needs that you would have in a suburban area, and would want to follow that line of thinking. I would not agree that it's some way going to distort the land use design process. As a matter of fact, I would make one point about that has seemed very interesting to us. The thing that makes the architectural community very nervous in San Francisco is that the new system of allocating space that has the requirement of architectural quality is going to force the developer to go get the best architects in the country to compete effectively for that space, so that the developer will be looking outside of San Francisco for architectural assistance rather than with the San Francisco architectural industry. That suggests that there's a public interest being served right there with urban design, from my point of view.
We have a thick wad of questions, and
not enough time, I hope.
last week I said that we had an unusually long, an unusual group of very long questions, but that seems to have been topped this week. I think planners inspire long questions. That's,
without question.
okay.
They're one of the occupational hazards.
right. Several are directed to Con Howe about the
It's all right if I go to San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll get different treatment.
announcement. No, several on one subject, and I'm going to try to throw them all together. Deal with the announcement today to which I alluded before. Today, Mr. Trump announced his plan to build the world's tallest building on our west side. Brendan, sort of nice and folksy. Brendan Gill, in response, implied that New York is expected to have the biggest and best. What are your feelings about the insistence of Trump to restore New York's title of having the tallest building? Shouldn't having the best take precedent over having the biggest? Shouldn't city regulatory agencies such as the Art Commission have some say over a major alteration to our skyline? And then the questioner ends with a particularly provocative, very general question: should the skyline, in fact, be landmarked? So that either of you may want to respond to that question.
Well, let me
The final
first say
part.
that this is the fourth site in Manhattan that I know Mr. Trump has proposed the world's tallest building. So I don't view today's announcement as either the
As
beginning
news?
or- I'll leave that to
He'll
journalists
just
such
keep.
as
I mean, I'm
yourselves.
sure if this one gets turned down, he'll keep moving uptown with it, I suppose.
Actually, that has been the progression of the four
Yeah,
sites.
they've
They are
all
moving
gone
uptown.
Right, exactly.
It actually makes me want to come back to another point, which is again a difference between New York and San Francisco. The whole question of height, because you mentioned, in looking at the plan, I know that there are very specific height limitations placed in virtually every zone of
Dean, you ain't gonna get no world's tallest building. I can see that.
We're headed in the other direction.
Right.
And that's something that New York does not have, except in some historic districts. And I think that it's very easy to criticize buildings simply because of their height. But to me, you have to look back over the history of the city. And certainly, at the same time people will say they don't want any building to be over X height, they then are the same people who will say their favorite building is the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, or other significant protrusions on our skyline. And I think it's not that there is one answer, but I do feel that in Manhattan, where frankly the diversity of architecture and the great differences in scale are part of the city's qualities and what makes the skyline what it is, that height as an absolute factor is something that government has to be very cautious about. I mean, in the same way that I don't think there's any reason New York has to have the world's tallest building, I don't think there's a rule that says New York shouldn't have any building taller than X. I think the right building designed the right way in the right place ought to be permitted. That in no way begins to imply that I think this fourth site of Mr.
You're not
Trump's is the
endorsing
right one.
It's actually the best of the four, though. I mean, in a sense. And I mean, I say this even having written a column for tomorrow that is not exactly enthusiastic, shall we say. But nonetheless, and this is sort of, I make this point admitting that it's irrelevant at the same time, it's a better site than Midtown or the Coliseum or downtown or whatever,
But see,
to which you can
actually-
respond, so what, I
See,
suppose.
actually, I think you could get a lot of people to debate that, because one of the sites was on Wall Street, where
Right.
from a point of view of impact, it was the worst site. I mean, you're
Sure.
crowding that many people into the most dense part of the city. And yet, from the point of view of maybe that questioner, if you were looking at the skyline, the image of the city sort of growing out of the shoreline and rising to a pinnacle. I remember actually when there was a proposal for the world's tallest building at Wall Street, we got a ton of letters that were very upset that the World Trade Center had been permitted to be built on one edge of the island because they thought from the Staten Island Ferry or whatever, it looked like the island was tilted that way. So, I mean, and your West Side site would certainly be a water.
That's actually a very perceptive point, though, that from the standpoint of the idea of the aesthetic of the skyline, it's better off where, by certain other planning criteria, it does not belong. It's in effect what you're saying, which I think is interesting.
Well, Paul, I think that was the point I would make, is that no longer can we talk about height in San Francisco as a technical conclusion. It is such a political question in San Francisco that it no longer stands up to the idea that height could be absorbed one place versus another place. But I think from our experience is that we've never viewed the question of height as simply a skyline question. Now, we are looking at the question of skyline because we feel our skyline has far too many buildings that simply offer a flat roof and do not give any visual entertainment or recreation or interest to people who have every right to look at that skyline from that point of view, because we feel the collection of buildings is a civic question. But the issue for us in San Francisco is, what are these buildings doing to congestion, to the livability of the city? That is the question in our minds in San Francisco. And I would suspect that where we are moving in San Francisco in planning as such is taking the issue of concentration of jobs and the need for people to move and linking it some way to the needed extended capacity to move people around. We created 100,000 new jobs in downtown San Francisco between 1970 and 1980. Statistically, almost all of those jobs, all of those people came to work by public transit. We've done cordon counts in downtown San Francisco. In that decade, there were no more cars entering downtown in the latter part of the decade than they were in the first part of the decade. So the issue for us is congestion, and as a result, the livability of the city. Whether the building is right or wrong from that point of view, I don't know. It can be measured in New York.
Right. A pair of questions directed to Con Howe. First, is the New York City zoning resolution destined to be translated into a computer software package? If so, when? And if not, why not? It's interesting.
There is experimentation about how to put it into a software package so that people can purchase it and use it on their PC. I'm not sure it'd be a bestseller except among architecture firms, but it does actually raise a more underlying point, which is how to make the zoning regulations of any city understandable. And I will say one thing about San Francisco's, which is enviable, is that whether people think the restrictions are draconian or however they feel, at least they're clear. I mean, it is precise. It is all laid out. I think that's something that any municipality has to work towards, is a clarity, so that people at least know what is permitted, what isn't permitted, and they can and architects can plan accordingly rather than always trying to shift among those things.
Being that the South Bronx has great development potential, and I should point out, I'm for a moment at least going to choose a number of questions that take us away from some of the skyscraper issues to try to broaden this a little bit. Being that the South Bronx has great development potential, not only by virtue of its close yet discrete proximity to Manhattan, sounds like writing a real estate ad already, but as well its intrinsically rich geographic features, Is this area being considered by the Planning Commission for development? If so, when, by whom, and for whom? How will it affect the immediate surrounding neighborhoods?
See, that makes me think of an underlying trend. There's always been times in the history of planning when the idea that public intervention can just make something happen, and that's basically what the theory behind urban renewal. I think that the experience in the South Bronx in the last few years has been much more city investment in rehabilitating apartments and bringing back what was there, rather than the wholesale attempts to put a whole new world on a area. It's trying to reestablish neighborhoods, bolster them, and in the long run, I think that that's really the solution for the city and its neighborhoods. It makes me think that it's really the difference between, say, Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs. And I think what you see now is a whole generation of planners and architects and people who grew up reading Jane Jacobs as a guiding light in these fields. And I think in the South Bronx, where if you go up the Grand Concourse, for instance, you'll see building after building has been rehabilitated and are now occupied. I think that's much more likely the successful solution to development of the Bronx than any one massive government project.
Good. New York has recently chosen to become partners in developments in which the city owns the land and buildings. For example, Columbus Circle. I presume that means the city presently owns the land. Does San Francisco use this approach, and how does it affect the integrity of planning where the city has a vested interest in the monetary success of the development? It's a good question. Actually, if you can both answer it.
Yeah, I'll do it as quickly as I can. There are two ways the city gets involved in that kind of activity. Let me first cite, I don't know how many people in the audience, Paul, are acquainted with San Francisco, but just right south in the downtown area, south to the financial district, is a new area we call Yerba Buena Gardens. It includes the Moscone Convention Center, which is a relatively new project. Olympia, New York has purchased land from our redevelopment agency, which is a semi-independent state agency in California. Under California law. They are required to review proposals for building. In effect, they are a public developer. They are required to view that property and development with the Planning Commission. And we run into the very problem that the card talks about. As a part of that new convention center, Marriott is building a 1,500-room hotel. It is.
We just got one of those.
Yes, you just got one of those too, and I was rather struck by the mammoth size of that building on Times Square today.
Would fit right into the San Francisco plan. I don't know why it concerned you.
Yes, if it were broken down to about 10 buildings, right. It might. We got into a rather heated debate over the size and shape of that building. So here we had this public agency debating with the planning department the size. We actually reduced the number of rooms. The size of the hotel was important to the redevelopment agency because the revenue stream from the hotel was to build the Yerba Buena Gardens, or help build it, which is going to be a public theme park in downtown San Francisco. So we run into those problems when the city or a public agency becomes an owner of property. The second way we do it, and we have a lot less trouble, is when the city owns property, and we've been doing this, old reservoirs, for example, in San Francisco, property that we once owned for other reasons. We are now leasing it for 99 years to build housing on it, but we set the rules and design guidelines early on. So that we don't have a conflict between the need to sell the property at a level that is commensurate with what we need to get out of the land and what we can put on that land. We do run into that problem when we're working with another agency that has public authority.
Well, I think underlying that question is, should a government treat itself better when it dabbles in real estate than it treats private owners? And the answer is emphatically no. But I think the logical extension of that is, should it treat itself worse than it would if the site was simply privately owned? And I think the answer is also emphatically no. That if there's a standard for light and air and a standard for design and a standard for public spaces, they ought to be applied uniformly. And it should be applied to government property and it should be applied to private property. And I think the way the question was phrased, it said partnership. I'm not sure of what examples, but certainly in the Coliseum case, it's not a partnership. The MTA is strictly selling the property. There's no continuing financial involvement. But it is, if government had acquired property simply as a speculative investment, then I think, that shouldn't be happening. But in each of the cases I can think of, it was public property either because of tax arrears, which emphatically is not happening in Midtown Manhattan, but or because it was for a previous public purpose, which is no longer necessary.
Good. Is there a publication describing the San Francisco zoning law? It's a simple question.
Do you mean the entire zoning code?
Perhaps the new plan.
Yes, there is. There is. As a matter of fact, if there's someone in the audience who wants to see a copy of there are two documents. One is the plan, which is temporarily out of print, and the other one is the ordinance that converts the plan into law. We do have copies of the ordinance, and anyone wants to see it, if they want to stop by at the stage here after the program, perhaps I can get their address and we can mail you a copy, as long as there aren't some 300 of you. We can probably work that out.
Good.
We sell ours, Paul. I'll be glad to tell everyone where they can come and.
There you are, New York and San Francisco.
Perhaps I should revise my offer.
Yeah, you could have paid for your trip. What does New York do with the dismal buildings that the new zoning allowed? I'm actually not entirely clear on this. Shouldn't the goal be 100% great buildings, not 50-50?
If the reader would define what is a great building, I think we'd all have an easier way to answer. The changes in architectural opinion have been so dramatic over the years, and I think zoning is a natural reflection of those opinions.
Right.
I think the same way that postmodernism has come to architecture, contextualism has come to city planning, and a lot of the regulations of zoning have tried to emulate what is really the best in previous styles of architecture. For instance, the requirement for street walls, which I noticed is certainly an important part of the San Francisco plan. The requirement for street walls with setbacks above the street walls. Those are all things that are increasingly being reintroduced into the New York City planning regulation, and I think there will be a time, though, after what were pejoratively described as wedding cake buildings of the 50s, if those begin being rebuilt under the zoning as we're changing it over time, there'll be another movement, and people will say, give us Corbusian towers again. And I think
Donald Trump already has. He's ahead of the game once again. Right.
But I think we really have to be sure that or we have to recognize that architecture and city planning follow cultural taste, and that there are going to be these periodic changes. And at least in New York City, I think what it has resulted in, fortunately, is a very diverse architectural environment. And while no one in this room might like the architecture of 6th Avenue, there will be a decade sometime where it'll be popularly conceived that this was great architecture. Just as when other buildings were being built, whether it be Art Deco, and there was a period of time when Art Deco was out of style, now it is cherished. And I think that a really rich city is going to have examples of all of these trends in architecture. Fortunately, we have some of the best examples of each of those trends. Unfortunately, we also have, as it gets later in the trend, every city probably ends up with some of the worst examples.
I'm going to sort of wait 50 years and see, actually, before I respond. I mean, I agree with your point, except on the other hand, I don't think it's a simple swing of the pendulum. I think there are inherent facts about a lot of what was done on 6th Avenue that go beyond an issue of fashion, that I think are as much the cause of the current dissatisfaction with them as sort of fashion and trend. I don't know. I mean, you're right. I mean, we will have to see. And yet, on the other hand, I don't think it will be a simple swing of the pendulum back. I think.
If I may just make a brief comment, the size of the buildings on 6th Avenue, of course, are far beyond anything that we have in San Francisco. I think the most immediate problem for me is the street level.
Right.
And what they have done to the street level, particularly, I guess, on the west side of the Rockefeller Center.
The Rockefeller Center extension, yeah.
I think that, as city planners, we have learned a lot.
Yeah, and I think those are lessons that we will not actually, the pendulum will not swing back from those particular lessons.
Historically, though, keeping the street wall and finding ways for people to be interested where they walk and look at the shops and feel the sense of urbanity that you're supposed to have there. They are the antithesis of that, it seems to me, and no era is going to make them acceptable. In my mind,
I would agree with that.
Okay.
And you're quite right that I think what has happened is we've learned over 20 years, and maybe a hell of a lot too slowly, but we've learned how open spaces have to be made active and enjoyable to really be an asset. Otherwise, they're just a pedestal for a modernism piece of architecture. But I think of that sometimes when I go past 140 Broadway, which has absolutely not a blade of grass or a planting, but it has the wonderful Noguchi sculpture. And it is indeed simply a pedestal for that building, which is a very elegant statement of modernism. And I think, although that is completely out of trend now, I think I will agree with you. 6th Avenue may never come back.
But that will.
But something like that will be seen as an
I think actually even more sooner than you think, in a sense. I mean, I've sensed, and I've just been working on something on this very issue, that there's already the sort of beginnings of a sort of small correction, as it were, in attitudes that is going to get fueled even more by the big Mies van der Rohe Centennial show that the Museum of Modern Art will mount in February, toward a sort of renewed respect for really serious, good modernism as opposed to 6th Avenue or 3rd Avenue modernism. So I think you're absolutely right.
And I know, as you've said in a lot of your articles, we're entering a phase in postmodernism where people are going to rebel against the slathering on of
excess,
of details just because there's some historical reference. And that's, I think, ultimately why it's such a area for caution in terms of government regulation, where they begin to get into those aspects of architecture. I certainly think it's proper for government to be dealing with urban design and the public spaces, and certainly the scale and light and air qualities of a building. But when it gets into the detailing, and I don't mean to attack the San Francisco model, but I think one of the things that most strikes me about it is the part about the tops of buildings, where very forthrightly described that San Francisco will require sculptured tops of buildings. And that, I must tell you, it worries me. I think if bureaucrats in New York were to pick the tops of buildings, we'd have a parade of towers with funny little hats on them. And I worry, I don't know what government regulation would end up in San Francisco, but I think it does cause concern.
Let me say a couple things about that. I don't think we share the view here at all. Our interest is not to design the building. Our interest is to nudge the architect and his client to do better. Caesar Pelli, for example, is doing a major building on Market Street for Olympia, York. And we are looking at a building there that he has come up with a very creative idea, and I would have to have Paul Goldberger's skills to describe it. But we're actually looking at a piece of sculpture that will rise up at the top of the building. And he has engaged an artist to design the top of the building as an art form, a piece of sculpture, if you will. I think it's going to be extraordinarily exciting. It is what the downtown plan wants to have happen. We want the artist and the architect to go to work and to show us what they can do. And I think the Pelli building is going to be a fine example of that. We do get into design. For example, we have prohibited reflective glass in all skyscrapers in downtown San Francisco.
I might add, Caesar Pelli's newest buildings in New York have reflective glass.
Well, he won't do it in San Francisco. Now, the reason for that is that we do not want buildings that look anti-human, that look like they're sealed off for the environment. I was walking up to Times Square from 34th Street today, and I was looking at the McGraw-Hill building. You can actually see the old McGraw.
The old one,
you can
yeah.
see people there. You can see the lights in the ceiling. It looked like it's a workplace. If you have reflective glass, you have turned your back to the city. We don't want it in San Francisco. We also know that when you have reflective glass, it causes the sunlight to be cast in a peculiar way on the ground and the adjacent buildings, and heats up the environment, causes temperature to rise. We think we have, the point I'm making is that we think we have solid reasons that go beyond the judgment of the architect and enter into the question of civic design and city planning, and the public has an interest in ensuring that the planners that are hired to do this are protecting their interests. I used to be far more understanding of the idea that architects should be left alone with the developer to do the job. I've been doing this 30 years now. I do not believe that anymore. I think the city planner has a strong role to play to protect the public's interest in design as it relates to neighbors, as it relates to the collection of buildings that make up the city. Paul once said that it is zoning and the laws of this era are a social contract. Mm-hmm. I believe that very strongly. And we have to play that role. If we don't do it, you can't expect elected officials without people who we expected to be the experts in this area. Mm-hmm. We have to advise and keep thumping with the people who make decisions to ensure that in this whole area of city building, there is a public purpose. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask a pair of questions that are quite closely related, or might stimulate the same answer. Maybe that's the way to put it. Perhaps California developers have a higher consciousness than those in New York and can see benefits for the many as opposed to the few in New York. Perhaps consciousness raising is what New York developers and planners are lacking rather than zoning plans or ordinances. And somewhat related, are public officials and the major organs of opinion in New York City more beholden to developers than those in San Francisco? Is the political and economic power of developers in New York responsible for the climate that makes zoning regulations like San Francisco's seem extreme? Con, can you try to respond to those?
Let me say the question about consciousness raising. I think one of the great things that's happened in New York in the last 10 years in terms of development and architecture has been the coming of developers from outside the city. I don't know if it just coincides with a greater diversity in architecture or whether it's the reason for it, but I think that the developers that have come in have brought new ideas, have brought many first-class architects to the city, and have forced a competitiveness within the New York development community that is definitely healthy. Olympia in York, you mentioned, the Gerald Hines company, the number of developers who have basically come into the city and said we can develop elsewhere, we can develop in New York City. And I think they have. I think it shows that no matter how big the pond is, it can always use some new fish. And I think that's helped New York. As to maybe I should let you answer for the journalistic community and the opinion-making community. Certainly, real estate and development is an important part of the city's economy. I don't know if, in terms of relationship with other cities, it's any different, though.
Yeah, well, my sense, as I look at a lot of cities, is that I think public officials might, over the course of a generation, be thought to have been a little less tough than they might have been on real estate development, but beholden is not a word I would ever use comfortably. I certainly don't think the press is beholden, but what do I know? I would at least like to think that we in the press are not beholden. I have always felt that the city has tended to take threats from the development community perhaps a tiny bit more seriously than need be, and could in fact afford to be at least a little bit 1 degree tougher consistently. But that is not enough to make me feel comfortable with a word like beholden. No.
I think partly the evidence of that is in tough times when there's a recession and no one's building, the city does seem to lean back and do whatever's necessary to get construction underway. And that gets back to, I think, a problem that's always in planning is how much should we be concerned about the economics and the job-producing capacity of the city, and how much about the built form. When you think about it, the proper answer from a scale and density point of view isn't going to change in boom times or depression. It's the same people going to the same places, the same light and air. So those issues ought to be treated consistently. But I think it's undeniable that in boom times, cities, not just New York, but any city, ends up tightening down, and in times when there's just no construction, they suddenly change their tune. I don't know. Do you feel that it's the boom time in San Francisco in the last 10 years that's helped create the environment?
Yeah. Let me give you a quick California view of in response to the question. One is that I don't think the California developer has a less drive for the fruits of enterprise than the one in New York does. I think they are more accustomed to planning officials in city and county government being involved in the process. So planning is far more institutionalized in California than it is in New York. So the expectation of a developer is he's got to deal with these birds. So he or she is prepared to do that. What I would also feel is that my experience has been, after dealing with dozens of developers, and it's the same developers you folks deal with in California, is that the new developer, whether it's Olympia York or the Campo Corporation or some of the others that are big in the field, they're better than the old developer. But my other experience has been is that I don't believe there is a more creative sense of a more creative group of people in the United States than a developer. They're extraordinarily entrepreneurial. But what's got to be done here, you've got to harness that energy to a civic end, or they'll get out of hand on you. And I say that in the best sense. That unless the government is in there as a partnership in city building, and I don't want to sound extraordinarily repetitive, but that's the answer. We've got to be in there as a partner in city building that represents a different interest from the developer's interest, who is extraordinary as a business person. No question about it. But boy, we've got to make sure that the government is representing the people properly in that process. And there isn't a bigger industry in California than the development industry. And that's particularly true in San Francisco. Now, we're not up to your standards for and cost per square foot, but when you're trading land in downtown San Francisco at $1,500 a square foot to build, the government better be involved, is my point of view.
I also think that the kind of government action that you're talking about really forces architects to do better work. I think it is true. Developers will look to cut corners, whereas if you create an environment where there are standards and where there are requirements of all developers, they will just consider that a cost of business, and they will hire architects who can meet those standards. They will give their architects they will turn it over to them and say, get me through this process, get me a building that meets the standards outlined in this municipality. So I think in a lot of cases, the kind of review or partnership that you're talking about helps the architect with a developer who is going to otherwise just walk over them.
I get a sense, though, and this came particularly out of a meeting I had with a major developer a couple weeks ago who's contemplating a very big project, and listening to him talk about it, that they almost consider it sort of part of the game. And that in a funny way, in the same way, if you're on a football team and the other team barely exists and you end up scoring 12 touchdowns, there's sort of nothing very sporting about it. I think in the same way, you really have a sense that even though they would never admit it, developers kind of, at this point, expect the city and the community and so forth to at least make a couple of moves that require them to be inventive in where they put their chess pieces and how they make their counter moves. And that they don't really deep down want to be able to, announce a plan with great fanfare and put the bulldozers into the earth tomorrow. I mean, it's almost become part of the culture of building now.
I think the same kind of entrepreneurial spirit that makes an individual terribly successful developer is the same that would be deprived of their greatest love if there wasn't a fight.
I think that's exactly, that's maybe a better way to put it. Exactly.
The only thing that I think can change that is that we have to remember that not every development, not every project is sponsored by an entrepreneurial multimillionaire. Right. There are, besides the great amount of development done by homeowners and very small investors, it's the institutional investors, where I suspect the answer is basically different. That it's they don't want trouble, and they of course, in New York City, they tend to end up then not building themselves. They end up and a perfect example, actually, is the 60 Wall Street building, where Morgan Guaranty has been across the street from that site for a couple hundred years and could have purchased it at any time and hired as terrific an architect as Kevin Roche. But in this case, it took George Klein, an entrepreneurial developer, to put it together, get the approvals, which I might add, I think part of the way that the building won its approvals, because it had to be approved by both the Landmarks Commission and the City Planning Commission, was because of its architectural quality. And but again, it took his entrepreneurial spirit to put it together, and then I'm sure he's been rewarded quite well in selling it to Morgan Guaranty.
Right. We're almost out of time. Let me give you each a very quick question, and then we'll conclude with one other. To Mr. Howe, what is Mayor Koch's interest, if any, in city planning? Is that answerable?
From the presentations I've made to the mayor on a number of planning studies. I think the thing that strikes me the most is his common sense and his attitude as a New Yorker on the street. He doesn't engage in architectural criticism in that way. He instead really is representative of a New Yorker on the street, and the questions he'll ask will be, well, what's it going to be like at ground level? What's going to happen to the stores in this area? It's very common sense and direct. And I think, frankly, in a chief executive, not knowing many mayors who are architectural critics themselves, what you really want is common sense and someone who understands what the average citizen wants their city and
Right.
physical environment to be.
It's a good answer.
It's a truthful one, too.
Dean, since you claim that the San Francisco Planning Commission uses aesthetic discretion as one of its criteria for whether a building is to be built, please explain how and why the commission allowed the City of Paris department store to be torn down and Philip Johnson allowed to build Neiman Marcus.
Right, and luckily I can tell the person who wrote that happened before I got to the planning. For people in the audience who don't know this issue, just let me quickly say it was an issue right on Union Square in San Francisco as to whether an old department store building should be retained in favor of a new one that Philip Johnson was to design. The issue was a very heated one. The environmental and preservation community went to the mat over the attempt to preserve the old building, and the commission voted to allow the building to be demolished. Now, under our landmarks law, it was not really at a level where, in the long run, the building could have been preserved, in all fairness to the commission. But the commission felt, and former planning directors felt, that it should not have been retained. Alan Jacobs, a name that some of you may know, who has written a good deal since he left the directorship, was one who did not favor the retention of the building. So it was an arguable case. I think what we can say about the new building that Philip Johnson designed, and I saw the drawings of the new building about a month after I arrived as a planning director, and I actually called Mr. Johnson and asked him whether he felt this building was suitable for the Union Square environment. It has Paul could describe it far better than I could, but it has granite in a checkered, offsetting way that fits no particular pattern or character of any of our other buildings in Union Square, and it is now regarded by most San Franciscans as a wrong building for that location. When I talked to Ms. Johnson about it, we talked at great length about granite and the history of granite. We never really did get to the issue, but 2 days later, Richard Marcus called the mayor, and I had lunch with the mayor and Richard Marcus to discuss the building. It was far beyond any possible alteration on my part because the Planning Commission had already approved that design. But
It is the world's largest checkerboard with
yes,
a very weird glass tower in the corner.
It's a home for Ralston Purina.
Right, exactly. Best, well said. It is not Philip Johnson's proudest moment, there's no question. Final question for each of you, if you can answer as briefly as you can, a question that you'll see in a moment you could spend all evening on. What additional limits, requirements, or restrictions would you personally like to see imposed in your city? Any?
I don't know how I ended up the first to answer that. But
want to think for a minute? You can.
I think that there has to be more thought given, a constant monitoring of what's happening under the development of the city. I think there tends to be too much, you get through one change, and it's a dramatic one or it's retching, and there's been a lot of opposition or support and fights in it. And the city too often tends to just step back and then let something ride. I think that's really the problem we ended up having in Midtown, where we really rewrote the whole zoning code in 1961. And by early 1980s, it was 20 years old. And when you think about it, we should have been able to monitor it over those 20 years more closely to be able to adjust it. I think that we're trying to do a better job at that. As I say, we're hardly 3 years into the new Midtown zoning, and we're monitoring all the development under it. And frankly, I expect we'll be making refinements very soon. But it is that kind of constant monitoring has to be done in a field that where the needs change, the opinion changes, and we do have to do a better job of that.
Okay.
Well, Paul, let me comment very briefly. I agree with the monitoring idea, which we talked about it with respect to the downtown plan. I think we've sort of exhausted ourselves with the downtown plan for that part of the city. But let me speak just generally about San Francisco. Everyone has a favorite San Francisco, and the city is often described as very narcissistic because it is always, I know of no other city in America that quite observes itself in the process of change as San Franciscans do. And everybody has an opinion. Herb Cain, one of the popular columnists for the San Francisco Chronicle, I think his favorite San Francisco was somewhere in 1935, something along that. Everything since then has been wrong rather. And cities must adapt to new spaces. The cities must change. We know they're going to change. The issue is not are they going to change. The question is how are they going to change? And we have been moving in San Francisco to continuously lower the potential for building to what exists on the ground. Now, we do that for a couple of reasons. I remember an article you wrote a couple of years ago about what are the limits. Are there limits to density, intensity, and so forth? Obviously, in theory, there has to be. On the other hand, as now we move away from our work on the downtown plan, we are looking at the most critical areas around downtown, and many of you will know these areas: the Tenderloin District, the Chinatown District, the North Beach District, Telegraph Hill, the South of Market District, are all areas adjacent to downtown San Francisco. And as we push downtown, the issue gets to be what are we causing and what impact will there be on those adjacent districts that taken together make up a great image of San Francisco. It is those old neighborhoods that make up people's view and image and look and feel of San Francisco. We have been moving, for example, in the Tenderloin, we have lowered height limits in the Tenderloin to nearly the prevailing heights of 8-story buildings in the Tenderloin, where some 15 to 20,000 housing units exist, where many Vietnamese are immigrating to San Francisco, are now living in, and you're struck by the number of kids that are in the street. The issue for planners there, and where I have to be directing, I think, our strategy for planning, is to keep those units on the market some way or another as the low, moderate housing stock of the city. And precisely how to do that is a very difficult thing, and in part we can do it through zoning. And the great concern I had as we lowered those height limits and we took the zoning envelope, as it were, as those of you who know that word in the profession, and moved it down to the existing buildings. The argument was, well, if we do that, we take speculation out. I think that can be understood. But at the same time, the building owner, and we don't have the phenomenon of abandoned buildings in San Francisco. People do not walk away from property in San Francisco. So as we do that, are we going to force the gentrification of that neighborhood? gets to be an interesting issue. So the puzzling question for us is how to use the zoning instrument to protect those low, moderate income housing units that exist in a ring around downtown San Francisco. I don't know that we have the answer for it, but we are lowering that zoning because we're recognizing the fact there are limits to intensity and density in the city and a level of comfort and livability that has to some way be respected in public policy.
Con, good. Thank you. We have. It's been a conversation, I think, of sort of unusual range and depth, and we've heard from two of the planners who are doing some of the most important work in this country, in one great city and one small town. And,
good description.
I want to thank both of them for being here, and thank all of you as well. Good night. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.